With a total of 165 million cases and 3.4 million deaths reported globally as of May 2021, the widespread nature of the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on our society is indisputable. In addition to these high morbidity and mortality rates, the lockdowns and social distancing measures which have been implemented in response to the virus have undoubtedly altered most aspects of the lives of people worldwide, including students at schools and universities. Although the full extent of the impact of COVID-19 is yet to be determined, researchers have begun to examine the impacts of the abrupt transition to online learning amidst the height of the first wave of COVID-19. This existing literature predominantly focuses on student perceptions, attitudes, motivation to learn, challenges and opportunities, and how virtual environments have influenced academic success and workplace readiness. It is important to note that the majority of this literature focuses on university students overseas, rather than the experiences of Australian university students during the pandemic. As COVID-19 is still ongoing, there are significant gaps in research which need to be addressed, particularly concerning the effects online learning has had on Australian university students thus far. Therefore, our study set out to investigate how the transition to online learning during COVID-19 influenced the attitudes of healthcare students at James Cook University. The aim of this study was to investigate how the transition from face-to-face learning to online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic influenced the attitudes of university students towards their studies. It was hypothesized that self-reported measures, including student levels of participation, engagement, and enjoyment of their studies, were lower during the online learning period compared to face-to-face learning. This hypothesis was tested and analyzed through a mixed method research approach. A mixed method study design was selected for this research project as the integration of quantitative and qualitative data through this approach enables a more complete and synergistic utilization of data. This integrated approach facilitates a comprehensive understanding of a phenomenon and allows for a more in-depth answer to a research question. Furthermore, it was decided that a concurrent mixed method approach would be the best fit for this study, as data collection and analysis needed to occur within a restricted timeframe. To collect and analyze quantitative data surrounding the research topic, an observational study design was selected to investigate and record the exposure and outcome as they naturally occurred. Specifically, an analytical cross-sectional study design was chosen to measure the exposure and outcome at the same point in time. The reasoning for this choice in study design was largely attributed to time constraints. Cross-sectional studies have several advantages, including being relatively time-effective and easy to conduct, having the ability to measure the prevalence of all factors under investigation, enabling multiple exposures and outcomes to be studied, and allowing for descriptive analysis to generate or answer a hypothesis. Conversely, one limitation of a cross-sectional study is that it cannot determine temporality or causality. Therefore, this study design is not able to explain whether an exposure preceded or resulted from an outcome. Additionally, confounders will often be unequally distributed throughout a cross-sectional study and can cause a spurious association, which is another limitation to this design. For the qualitative component of this study, a phenomenological approach was selected. This study design focuses on discerning the essence of a lived experience through a focus on the experiences of an individual. A key strength of phenomenological studies is the level of depth and insight they provide on an individual's experience with a complex phenomenon. This insight was useful in analysing the attitudes of students towards online learning by providing a greater understanding of experiences surrounding engagement, enjoyment, and participation in online classes compared to face-to-face learning. The benefit of gathering insight through personal experiences also contributes to the limitation of implementing a phenomenological design. Gathering personal experiences may be time-consuming, and the data collected, while the researchers may draw common themes from participants' responses, their answers may not be generalised, which brings challenges later in the analysis of data. Furthermore, allowing open-ended discussions through the study design leaves room for error, particularly concerning bias, credibility, and rigour.
To be eligible to participate in our study, an inclusion and exclusion criteria was formed. Students who wished to partake in our study had to have been enrolled in either HS3401 or HS2405, and therefore be studying physiotherapy, speech pathology, or occupational therapy. Furthermore, students had to be studying these subjects at JCU here in Townsville and were required to have been enrolled as an internal student with the university prior to the online transition, which occurred in March 2020. This ensured all potential participants had completed a minimum of 1 semester of online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, which they could reflect upon during our study. Students who did not meet criteria were deemed ineligible and unable to participate. All data was collected via a survey we created using Google Forms and through in-depth interviews. The survey consisted of 22 questions, which included both multiple choice and short answer questions. We released a link to the survey using our class discussion board on Learn JCU, and all students in our HS3401 and HS2405 subjects had access to it. From the survey, we then asked participants if they would be interested in participating in an interview to further enhance our findings. These interviews were held via Collaborate and ran for approximately 15 to 30 minutes depending on the participant. The interviews were audio recorded and later transcribed by our research team.
The first statistical test performed aimed to investigate the presence of an association between students' study location and students' level of engagement during online learning. Variable 1 was identified as a student study location as a categorical and nominal variable. The categories for questions related to this variable were exclusive, meaning there is no overlap between the responses and each response answer fits into one category. The second variable was students' level of engagement. This was measured as categorical and ordinal responses. A chi-square test was performed. Parametric features were non-applicable as the data was unpaired and association was only measured during the online learning period. The second statistical test aimed to investigate students' beliefs about whether their grades were impacted by the number of hours they spent studying during online learning. Variable 1 was the students' grades. Confidentiality and anonymity regarding these questions was practiced, and participants provided consent by ticking a box at the beginning of the survey. This outlined that the responses provided were only used for research purposes. Grades were a categorical and ordinal response, as they could be ranked by improved, stayed the same, or declined/went down. Variable 2 is the number of hours spent studying, and an ANOVA test was performed to examine for any statistically significant differences between the means of two or more unrelated groups. Qualitative data obtained through the survey, questionnaire, and in-depth interviews was analysed through the use of a coding framework. Once codes were established based on the raw data, they were categorised by a systematic process of grouping common codes. Finally, themes were established by determining relationships between these categories.
Throughout the study, we adhered to ethical considerations, including informed consent, right to withdraw, and confidentiality. To ensure participants were informed prior to consenting to our survey, we included a brief introductory statement which explained the purpose of our study and how results were going to be used. Participants were unable to complete the survey unless they acknowledged they understood the purpose of the study by agreeing they had read the statement and consented to participating. Written consent was obtained through email for those that participated in the interviews and was reiterated verbally prior to commencing. The right to withdraw was provided to all participants by ensuring questions could be left blank in the survey and that participants could leave at any time. The same was applied to the interviews, where participants were notified at the beginning that they could withdraw at any time should they feel distressed or not want to continue. Confidentiality was adhered to by keeping the results anonymous and de-identifying all interview data. Our data was also only accessed by our research team to ensure this. Analysing the results, Table 1 highlights the descriptive characteristics of the sample population. There was 121 eligible participants for this study, however only 39 students participated in the survey. The median age of the participants was 20 years old, with a range of 18 to 48 years. Participants consisted of females and males, and there was a mixture of speech pathology students, occupational therapy students, and physiotherapy students. Overall, 66.7% of students were studying HS3401, while 33.3% were studying HS2405. Table 2 demonstrates how students' study location impacted their level of engagement during online learning. Missing data is present in these results. It shows that 69.2% of students felt they were somewhat engaged in online learning regardless of their study place. 6 students responded that they were not engaged at all while studying in their bedroom, and 13 students said they were only somewhat engaged. Additionally, 12 students were found to be somewhat engaged when studying in their home office study location. Table 3 describes how students' grades changed based on the number of study hours during the online learning phase. Overall, 26.3% said their grades improved regardless of the number of hours spent studying. 36.8% said their grades remained the same, whilst 28.9% said their grades dropped. There is also missing data present in these sections.
When thematically analysing the qualitative data, the themes could be split into both positive and negative attitudes. These were then split further into participation, engagement, and enjoyment, which were the main 3 themes that the qualitative analysis provided.
The aim of this study was to investigate how the transition from face-to-face learning to online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic influenced the attitudes of university students towards their studies. Results were quantitatively analysed by running 2 separate tests using SPSS to investigate the relationship between chosen variables. As we hypothesised, students' engagement, participation, and enjoyment of their studies decreased during the online learning period. We decided to focus our investigation on how the number of hours spent studying during the online learning phase and the environments in which students' studies influence their overall engagement of grades. A chi-square test was conducted to determine the presence of a relationship between study location and students' overall level of engagement when participating in online studies. After reviewing literature regarding common study locations for university students, we provided students with 4 options in the survey. Options included bedroom, home office or study, outdoors, and other. When these variables were cross-tabulated, it was found that there was missing data in some of the categories. As a result, we had to analyse the chi-square test using the Fisher's exact test. The p-value produced was 0.314, which indicates the results were insignificant as the p-value is above 0.05. This highlights a lack of sufficient evidence to support a relationship between study location and students' level of engagement. However, when we critically analysed the data by individually looking at the categories, it was found that 90.5% of students reported they studied in their bedroom. These same students were found to either be somewhat engaged or not engaged at all in their studies. This suggests a possible relationship between study location and level of engagement, although further research would be warranted to confirm this suggestion. Furthermore, an ANOVA test was conducted to determine the presence of a relationship between the number of hours spent studying during the online learning phase and how students' grades changed. In the survey, participants were provided with the options of 0 to 5 hours, 5 to 10 hours, 10 to 20 hours, 20 to 30 hours, and 30 plus hours, where they could choose which option best represented the amount of time they spent studying per week during the online phase. A Likert scale was used to investigate how students' grades changed during this time, with the scale options being improved, stayed the same, dropped, went down, and prefer not to save. The p-value produced with the ANOVA test was 0.160, which indicated the results were insignificant as the p-value was above 0.05. This highlights a lack of sufficient evidence to support there being a relationship between the number of hours spent studying and how students' grades change during the online learning phase. In contrast, relevant literature suggests that there is a relationship and that students who participate in longer hours of study tend to have greater academic success. However, the literature we reviewed reflects academic outcomes when studying face-to-face, whereas our study was focused on online learning. Therefore, further research and a larger sample size would be necessary to determine how many hours spent studying influenced students' academic success when studying online.
Results from the qualitative components of the study reveal common positive and negative attitudes towards online learning. These themes include decreased confidence in practical abilities and applicable knowledge, perceived benefits and disadvantages of routine disruption, and positive and negative aspects of social interaction. Several sub-themes were also associated with these central concepts. These findings correspond with existing studies examining students' perspectives on the emergency transition to online learning during COVID-19. Both participants who partook in the in-depth interviews discussed their decreased confidence in practical abilities and applicable knowledge, in terms of their specific learning experiences and grades. A consensus in findings illustrated that the students found participating in group work challenging, due to barriers such as lack of communication, the inability to work together in a physical sense, and the difficulty of holding group members accountable when online. This was highlighted by one participant who stated, "The concept of breakout rooms for group work is good, but in practicality it doesn't work. You can't enforce participation. People could theoretically just get up and walk away from their computer or sit there contributing nothing, which makes it hard to work as a group." This view aligns with the results from Adnan and Anwar, who found that 42.9% of students reported difficulties with completing group work and assignments via distance education. Additionally, the in-depth interview revealed that the transition to online learning negatively impacted individual grades, with both participants reporting that their grades suffered during online learning. When questioned about the cause of this outcome, one participant explained that the combination of increased subject workload and decreased opportunity to consolidate learning with the lecturer in person was a likely contributor. Alternatively, another participant pinpointed causes of distraction and motivation, stating, "I didn't have a designated study space, and with people coming and going, I found it difficult to concentrate and to stay motivated." Both of these perspectives, which reflect negative views towards participation and engagement, align with findings from existing literature. Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency analysis of the student experience of online learning quality project revealed similar themes of online workload, lack of engagement, inadequate support, home environment, and personal motivation as influences of student attitudes. Routine disruption was also referenced in both interviews. Both participants discussed their changing employment status and environmental changes over the transition from face-to-face learning to online learning. The students discussed their experience with moving from living and studying on campus to at home as a result of COVID-19. They discussed the impact of their study environment changing, which welcomed new challenges with distraction, motivation, and organisation. One participant recalled, "My family is very accommodating, but being at home there's a lot of noise and interruptions." Another participant shared a similar sentiment, stating all the distractions at home made it hard to stay motivated. Using the same environment for work and study made it easy to procrastinate. These findings were concurrent with a study that found a connection between students, study environments, and high dropout rates, with students who study online having higher dropout rates due to feeling unmotivated. A study by Harnett, George, and John agreed that the presence of formal and informal learning environments blurred the boundaries for students regarding work and rest, again to the degree that online learning is associated with low completion rates. However, both participants also identified benefits from studying at home, including the ability to access content from home and the decrease in transport and finances such as fuel costs. Consequently, a study by the Open University discussed the significant difference in energy and CO2 emissions of on-campus students versus online students, which supports the students' reports that they travel less and consume less fuel during online learning. Additionally, findings from the in-depth interviews revealed common themes of social isolation and lack of social connection, which were linked to decreased motivation. One student demonstrated this, commenting, "The thing I hated most about online learning was being away from people. It was isolating and made it so much more difficult to motivate myself to learn. Whereas on campus, you turn up to class and you learn with your peers." This perspective reflects widely documented findings from other studies pertaining to online learning. Bolger, Supernakorn, and Boggs, and Harnacker and Judgy indicate that feelings of disconnectedness and isolation are a common experience associated with online learning environments. Furthermore, these feelings often lead to a loss of motivation to learn and can even contribute to higher rates of student dropout.
Due to the time constraints and sample size, there are many notable limitations to this study. Random and systematic error was evident in the quantitative element of the survey. The most notable systematic error present was that the statistical analysis results presented significant numbers of 0 results. It is hypothesized that this was due to there not being enough participants to fill all categories of answers. Accordingly, it is theorized that this systematic error would be regulated by increasing the number of participants to increase the number of results per survey question. Random error was less obvious, but given that the survey participation was an expected part of the subject participation in HS3401 and HS2405 courses, some participants may not have selected results that accurately reflected their feelings towards online learning, which may have skewed the findings from the statistical analysis. When it came to the in-depth interviews, researchers were careful to maintain privacy and confidentiality. This was to ensure that participants felt as comfortable as possible with providing answers on their perspectives about online learning, without the risk of bias being caused by the presence of peers or lecturers. However, some issues pertaining to rigor and trustworthiness were evident. A limitation of the qualitative analysis was that only 2 participants volunteered to participate in an in-depth interview, which restricted the ability of researchers to draw qualitative themes across the interviews. It also reduced the evidence strength of the themes that were identified. Given that the in-depth interviews were conducted remotely over Blackboard Collaborate, the issue of transcription errors due to poor audio recording quality was also a possible limitation to rigor and trustworthiness of the interview data gathered within the study.
Overall, the findings from our study have several significant implications for students studying healthcare at JCU, as well as in a broader educational context. The quantitative and qualitative results indicate that the abrupt transition to online learning negatively impacted students' grades in addition to their engagement in and enjoyment of their studies. This highlights the need to improve the delivery of educational content through online platforms, especially with the uncertainty that still exists surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. In light of this, it is recommended that universities and academic administrators further invest in online education by providing instructors with the knowledge and resources to comprehensively deliver online content. Not only will this ensure academic continuity during times of emergencies, but it will improve students' outcomes. Additionally, it is recommended that universities implement support networks to assist students in coping with the educational and psychosocial impacts of online learning. Strategies to better support student well-being and academic access include avoiding overwhelming students with coursework by adapting learning objectives, teaching activities and assessment items, providing students with resources to develop self-directed learning and time management skills, and establishing channels to improve peer and student-instructor interactions. If implemented, these strategies are likely to alleviate feelings of isolation, enhance student well-being, increase engagement and participation levels, and improve academic results. Not only are these recommendations relevant to students at JCU, but they are also applicable on a national and international scale. The overall aim of the study was to identify the attitudes JCU students enrolled in HS2405 and HS3401 had towards the transition to online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. The research project used a mixed method study design where a survey was conducted to collect quantitative data along with a focus group interview to collect qualitative data. A chi-squared statistical test was completed which looked at 2 variables, student study location and students' level of engagement. The second statistical test used an ANOVA, which looked at students' grades and the number of hours spent studying during online learning. The results of the quantitative research indicated that there was a lack of sufficient evidence to support there being a relationship between the number of hours spent studying and how students' grades were affected. Furthermore, the qualitative data identified 3 key themes and several sub-themes which examined students' perspectives around the emergency transition to online learning. 2 students participated in the focus group where they both had decreased confidence in practical abilities and found participating in group work challenging due to lack of communication, the inability to work together in physical sense, and difficulty holding group members accountable online. Both participants found the transition to online learning had negatively impacted their grades, with having distractions and lack of motivation due to poor study environments. Through the use of a focus group, it was identified that the environment in which study was conducted influenced students' grades due to motivational factors, distractions, social isolation, and lack of social connections. In summary, it can be acknowledged that further research is recommended to confirm the possible relationship between study location and level of engagement. Limited research has been conducted around the impacts of online learning during COVID-19, highlighting the importance around conducting research on a greater scale. The significant findings indicated that it is important for research to be undertaken in order to help with setting up the education system for future emergency online learning. With the uncertainty of COVID-19 or the potential for future disease outbreaks, it will be beneficial for the education system to develop an emergency online plan to allow staff and students to easily transfer from face-to-face to online learning.